Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 23 April 2024. It is the 101st anniversary of the birth of Reinhart Koselleck, who was born in Görlitz, Germany on this date 101 years ago on 23 April 1923. Koselleck was a major figure in the development of conceptual history. I mentioned Koselleck earlier in my episode on J.G.A. Pocock because of the close similarity of conceptual history and history of discourses. Both in Koselleck's The Practice of Conceptual History and Futures Past on the Semantics of Historical Time, Koselleck compares and contrasts conceptual history not to history of ideas, which is what I would have expected, and not to the history of discourses, as with Pocock, but to social history. In Futures Past, Koselleck wrote, and he uses the English translation leaves the German conceptual history as Begriffsgeschichte, so I will leave it as it is in the text. Quote, Begriffsgeschichte is initially a specialized method for source criticism, taking note as it does of the utilization of terminology relevant to social and political elements, and directing itself in particular to the analysis of central expressions having social or political content. It goes without saying that historical clarification of past conceptual uses must refer not only to the history of language, but also to socio-historical data. For every semantic has its link to non-linguistic content. It is this that creates the precarious marginality of Begriffsgeschichte for the linguistic sciences, while being at the same time the origin of its great advantages for the historical sciences. The condensation effected by the work of conceptual explanation renders past statements precise, bringing more clearly into view contemporary intentional circumstance or relation in their linguistic makeup, unquote. And in the final paragraph of the section titled Social History and Conceptual History in the Practice of Conceptual History, Koselleck writes, once again relating social history to conceptual history, quote, social history and conceptual history have different speeds of transformation that are based in distinguishable structures of repetition. Therefore, the academic terminology of social history remains dependent on the history of concepts so as to assess linguistically stored experience. And equally, conceptual history remains dependent on the results of social history so as to keep in view the difference between vanished reality and its linguistic evidence, which can never be bridged, unquote. With these fine-grained distinctions among overlapping disciplines within history, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep traditions and methodologies distinct, even when they are intended to be kept distinct. So some kind of conceptual clarification is called for so that the distinctions will stand out more clearly to us. In several episodes, I have discussed the mapping of the conceptual geography of history, and conceptual history represents a definite region of the conceptual geography of history. And one way to keep conceptual history distinct is to map its relationship within the conceptual geography of history to other adjacent disciplines. So what do I mean by conceptual geography? When I use that term, I am implicitly referring to a passage from Donald Davidson in his book, Actions and Events, Essays on Actions and Events, which goes, quote, much of the interest in logical form comes from an interest in logical geography. To give the logical form of a sentence is to give its logical location in the totality of sentences, to describe it in a way that explicitly determines what sentences it entails and what sentences it is entailed by. The location must be given relative to a specific deductive theory. So logical form itself is relative to a theory. The relativity does not stop there either, since every even given a theory of deduction, there may be more than one total scheme for interpreting the sentences we are interested in and what preserves the pattern of entailments. The logical form of a particular sentence is then relative both to a theory of deduction and to some prior determinations as to how to render sentences in the language of the theory, unquote. It is entirely possible that Davidson's conception of logical geography is ultimately derived from Wittgenstein's earlier expressed conception of logical space that appears in the Tractatus, though Donaldson does not reference Wittgenstein in his exposition of logical geography. But I am assuming that with a little bit of effort, this conception of logical geography could be adapted to history, and that the various forms of history are regions within the logical space of history, and particular historical propositions are entailed by these particular regions of the logical geography of history. The many conceptions of history I have so far considered today in philosophy of history represent regions within the logical geography of history, some of them overlapping, some of them adjacent, and some of them separated. The idea of a separation in between disciplines within the logical geography of history is itself interesting, since the distance between any two given positions says something significant about both of the positions so separated and the positions that intervene between them, which if there are any, may constitute a kind of bridge between widely separated regions of the logical geography of history. We can locate Koselleck's work within the network of ideas of late 20th century and early 21st century historiography, all of which are adjacent or overlapping within the conceptual space of history. We could call this a cluster within the conceptual map of history. So there's not only a connection of conceptual history to social history that Koselleck himself delineated, and the relationship to history of discourses that Pocock delineated. There's also, I think, a hint of a relationship to Frank Ackersmith's work. Koselleck wrote, quote, "To talk about history and time is difficult for a reason that has to do with more than history. Time cannot be intuited. If an historian brings past events back to mind through his language, then the listener or reader will perhaps associate an intuition with them as well. But does he thereby have an intuition of past time? Hardly so. For only in a metaphorical use of language, for instance, in the sense in which one speaks of the time of the French Revolution without thereby making visible anything specifically temporal," unquote. My interpretation of this passage is that this is Ankersmith's problem of historical representation, but with the denial of the possibility of time being a denial of Ankersmith's sublime historical experience. The problem set of recent historiography drew Koselleck, Pocock, Ankersmith, and many others to parallel reflections, but to different conclusions, or we could say different entailments within the conceptual space of history. Even as historiography has become more conceptually complex and itself approximates philosophy of history in its conceptual commitments, all of the thinkers within this recent cluster on the conceptual map of history are skeptical of philosophy of history. In an interview, Koselleck said, quote, "The difficulty presented by the philosophy of history lies in the fact that all of the idealist systems posited or attempted to prove totalizing accounts of the entirety of history up to its supposed endpoint. This claim to totality is totalitarian when translated into the political realm, and as such, it has well-known consequences, in particular with Marxism, which was, after all, a result of these idealist philosophies of history. One can deploy the idea of a plurality of histories theoretically in opposition to these philosophies, and this is justifiable to my mind, though certainly with an important caveat, that the multiplicity of single histories, which can always be aphoretic and rule each other out, which do not permit a common interpretation and instead only breed contradictions, especially contradictions in interpretation, that beginning in the 20th century, this plurality nonetheless points to a common history, but one whose terminology I want to circumvent, for it has been coated over by philosophy of history, unquote. In this quote, we can see that philosophy of history is the problem and not the solution to any problem, historical or otherwise. But just as these thinkers that I have mentioned, and in this particular context, Koselleck, have drawn from the philosophy of history to formulate their denials of the philosophy of history, we too can draw from this sophisticated historiography to frame parallel positions in the philosophy of history. For example, in several episodes, I have mentioned the category of crisis as a touchstone in the philosophy of history to which many thinkers recur. Koselleck gives us a conceptual history of crisis in his essay, Some Questions Regarding Conceptual History of Crisis, which is included in his book, The Practice of Conceptual History. Koselleck makes the following observations about the failure of history to formulate a conceptualization of crisis. Quote, "It is certainly striking that no explicit theory of crisis was developed for the overall historical conceptualizations as opposed to the economic system of the 19th century. Jakob Burckhardt is the sole exception, and even Marx, who tried to connect his economic theory to a philosophy of history, sometimes became mired in developing a theory of crisis, something that Schumpeter, in reference to this concept, expressly renounced. Even in the 20th century, theories of crisis are restricted to specialized scientific spheres like psychiatry or political science. Global theories of crisis, like those on which the philosophy of history in the 18th and 19th century was implicitly based, quickly came to be regarded as dubious nowadays because they cannot be sufficiently confirmed or empirically substantiated," unquote. All of this is certainly true, and today we can certainly feel the want of a category of crisis suitable for a substantive philosophy of history, especially since the term was so frequently used and I would say overused in the 20th century. In an attempt at clarification, Koselleck adopts a couple of tripartite schematizations of crisis as tools of analysis, as follows. Quote, "First, history can be interpreted as a permanent crisis. World history is the judgment of the world. It is then a question of a concept of trial. Secondly, crisis can characterize a singular accelerating process in which many conflicts, bursting the system apart, accumulate so as to bring about a new situation after the crisis has passed. Crisis then indicates the crossing of an epochal threshold, a process that can repeat itself mutatis mutandis. Even if history always remains unique in individual cases, this concept attests to the possibility that the thrusts of change can take place in analogous forms. Therefore, I will suggest characterizing it as an iterative periodizing concept. Thirdly, crisis can mean purely and simply the final crisis of all history that precedes it, where proclamations of the Last Judgment are everywhere employed, but only metaphorically. When measured with respect to the prior course of our history, it can no longer be excluded that this model, necessarily characterized as utopian, has every chance of being realized in light of present-day means of self-destruction. In contrast to the others, this concept of crisis is a purely future-oriented one and aims at a final decision," unquote. All of these meanings of crisis are familiar to us today. And I said that we feel the lack of having a robust concept of crisis that we can use. And I would argue that crisis became so overused in the 20th century that now in the 21st century, we have many people talking about the meta crisis or the poly crisis, which is just an attempt to, it's an escalation of the rhetoric because crisis was never clearly defined, or as Koselleck said, it was never given a global conceptualization within history. Koselleck suggests at least a partial resolution to this that is also a tripartite distinction that consists of what he calls 3 exponential time curves. These exponential time curves are essentially 3 scales of time within which crises can be resolved. And they are a scale of billions of years within which the Earth is formed, a scale of millions of years within which humanity evolved, and a scale of thousands of years within which states formed. He then notes, quote, "The three exponential time curves might be dismissed as mere number play. However, a limit obviously begins to emerge and can no longer be overstepped by technological and scientific progress," unquote. And then just a little bit further on, quote, "The three exponential time curves can be read as an amplifier for acceleration, rendering it completely impossible to venture predictions into the future. Perhaps the answer to crisis consists in looking out for stabilizers which can be derived from the long duration of prior human history." Not only is unquote, not only is Koselleck on the right track here, but these are insights we can employ in a substantive philosophy of historical crises. The foreshortening of the recent past, which seems to cluster crises into a knot that adjoins the present, and which is, in a sense, inconceivable without the present, tempts us into an enterprise of extrapolating the crisis into the future, or extrapolating future crises. But as Koselleck observes, a limit begins to emerge. Also, when we look to what he calls the stabilizers of the deep past, our illusion of the crisis of the present is placed in a non-critical context. And I would claim that a Copernican philosophy of history would pay particular attention to this observation. So Koselleck is a difficult and sophisticated writer. He reminds me somewhat in this respect. His historiography, I should say, reminds me of J.G.A. Pocock, but he's not always difficult. His book Critique and Crisis is a little more readable, and it maintains a thesis of that the Enlightenment was essentially utopian and cut off political activity from its necessarily realistic roots of action, and well worth reading. And his Futures Past on the Semantics of Historical Time has an amusing beginning. We're all familiar with Foucault's beginning of the order of things with his analysis of the painting Las Meninas. So I assume in a kind of conceptual quote of Foucault, but I don't know this, that Koselleck starts his Futures Past with an analysis of Albrecht Altdorfer's Alexanderschlacht, the Battle of Issus from 333 BC, which is a fun read. And it was, in fact, reading that was one of the reasons I went to the Alte Pinakothek in Munich to see that painting by Albrecht Altdorfer. So some of Koselleck is a difficult read, and some of it is an easier go, but there is a lot to be learned here, and I could have made this episode much longer if I'd gone into more detail on his thought. So happy birthday, Reinhart Koselleck, and thanks for listening.